You've heard the contention before, but there are people who believe that the moon landings and the Apollo missions were not all they were cracked up to be. We've heard a lot of different versions of this story, and tonight Marcus Allen is going to present his version. We appreciate Marcus joining us on the program. Marcus, welcome to Beyond Reality Radio.
Hello, JV. Very nice to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
So the first thing, this is the first time you've been on our program, so I guess the best place to start is tell us a little bit about yourself. How'd you get started in all of this?
Well, it goes back about 20 years, maybe a bit longer than that, when I was attending a lecture, a conference in Glastonbury. You probably heard of Glastonbury with the music festival.
Sure.
But there are also lots of other things that go on in Glastonbury. One of them is a series of lectures in which actually it was an American presenter who was talking about something quite different, but he happened to mention the Apollo moon landings. And he said, well, you've all seen the photographs. I say this was about 20 years ago. It was all you could see then were the photographs. And he said, of course they're fake, you know that, don't you? And I thought, what a stupid thing to say. Now, I was trained as a photographer in London back in the 1960s, and I'd used the equipment, which I discovered subsequently that was used on the Apollo missions, the Hasselblad cameras, and I knew what the films could do or could not do. So I thought, well, I'll have a look at these pictures and just see if he's got a point. So I had a look at them, and the only way I could find the Apollo photographs was in books at the time, and I went to an astronomy show in London and got a series of postcards which showed some of the more well-known Apollo images, and I had a look at them, and I thought, oh, I see what he means. I can see that there's a certain amount of anomaly going on here, because I'd read quite a bit about the Apollo programs. I'm old enough to have been around when they actually happened. I know exactly what I was doing. I was looking out the window at 3:30 in the morning in London, where I was at the time, and looked at the moon and waved, but I didn't get any wave back. So I was familiar with what was going on. I was familiar with the equipment, and I started looking into it. And the more I looked into it, the more I found anomalies and inconsistencies and unexplained details. And from then on, I started doing public presentations on the subject, which were quite well received, by most people who hadn't really heard of this subject before. And they were interested to find out if they had been misled, possibly. Now, having started to look at it, I got into much more detail and started to finding other people who were also examining the same area. And they were finding similar anomalies, the same ones as I was. So we decided that maybe there was something amiss. Maybe we had been misled. Maybe Apollo was the very first example of fake news. And from that day onwards, 20 odd years ago, I've been investigating it pretty well full time, looking at the photographs. Now they're all available on the internet, and one can download them and examine them and put them into various manipulation programs to see if there are any anomalies in the photographs. The more I did that, the more I found there were anomalies, such as the famous Earthrise photograph, which most people are familiar with, taken as the craft allegedly orbited the moon with the Earth in the distance. And if you manipulate the photograph, you can find out that the Earth image has been added to the photograph. It's a double exposure. I thought, well, this is a bit odd. And the more I looked at it, and the famous ones of Buzz Aldrin coming down the ladder being photographed by Neil Armstrong, and you can see all the detail in his spacesuit, but he's in the shadow of the lunar lander. And he's coming down this ladder. There's a series of 8 photographs which are available. Anybody can look them up on the NASA website, or the one I use is the Lunar and Planetary Institute website. It just happens to be I prefer the way they've set it out. And you download the photographs and look at them in sequence. Now, having been a photographer, I was used to looking at what were referred to as, is probably very 20th century, contact sheets. I don't know if you remember contact sheets.
Sure, yeah, it was a bunch of smaller images.
That's right. It's the images of the actual negatives. These are films, don't forget. We're not talking digital images here. We're talking films, photographic films. And if you look at the photographs in sequence, you can normally tell from looking at a contact sheet what a photographer is actually attempting to do, how he's building up to get the photograph which he subsequently uses. And I looked at these photographs, the 8 images of Buzz Aldrin coming down the ladder of the Eagle, the Apollo 11 lander, July the 20th, 1969. And there's 8 sequence, and there's 2 of him coming out at the top of the ladder, and then Neil Armstrong obviously gets bored watching him, takes a photograph of the rubbish bag under the lander and one of the foot pads of the lander. Now Buzz Aldrin is still coming down the ladder at this point, and then he takes another series of 6 photographs of him coming down the ladder further down until he gets to the bottom of the ladder and he stands in the foot pad of the lander. And you can see highlights of light on his heel as he stands in the pad of the lander. Now, the only way you can get a highlight of light on a heel, in this case is a fairly shiny piece of rubber-type material, is if there is a light source to put it there. But there's no light source carried on Apollo. So there we have a major anomaly. Now, I know that a very large company called NVIDIA have done their analysis of this particular sequence of images and have come to a conclusion that it was perfectly possible to photograph it that way because of the reflectivity of the lunar surface, which throw enough light to illuminate Buzz Aldrin coming down the ladder, who's actually in shadow. And then you start looking into that, and you find out that they've actually manipulated it so that it comes out like that, because the surface reflectivity of the moon is 8%, i.e. 8% of the light that hits it is reflected from it. It's similar to a road surface. That has a similar level of reflectivity as the moon does. But if you up the reflectivity to 40%, which is what appears to have happened with the NVIDIA film, you'll get enough light reflected back to show the figure as it appears in the photographs. So it's been manipulated. And they actually proved that it had been manipulated by doing this particular sequence. Anyway, I carried on investigating because there's more than just the Apollo 11 mission. That was the first one that landed. There were 2 before that, which didn't land on the moon, Apollo 8 and Apollo 10. Apollo 9 was in Earth orbit, so that was testing some equipment. Then you start looking at the rocket itself, the Saturn V rocket, that whacking great piece of kit, 363 feet high, weighed about 3,000 tons, we're told, and it was able to launch 130 tons into lunar orbit. And then of that, 46 tons were sent to the moon, to orbit the moon. And that included the lander and the command module and all the equipment needed to get down onto the surface and back up again. But if you examine the actual takeoff of the Saturn V rocket, it doesn't appear to be going fast enough to have reached the orbit speed it needed to do to launch into lunar orbit. And then you start looking at how the Saturn V rocket was built. It was designed by Werner von Braun, who was the head of the rocket assembly plant at Huntsville in Alabama. And you look at the engines that were used. Now, the engines that were used on the Saturn V rocket are called F1 engines, and they're the most powerful rocket engine ever built, we're told. But because they're so powerful, they're also rather unstable. And Apollo 6, which preceded, was the first launch of the Saturn V rocket, almost destroyed itself by what's called the pogo effect, where you get combustion instability, which all sounds very technical. It basically means that the amount of fuel that needs to get into the rocket engine is so great that it doesn't always burn at the same rate. And it sets up a pogo effect, jumping up and down, which basically shakes the rocket almost to destruction. And the reports indicate that on Apollo 6, if there had been astronauts on board that, given the combustion instability that occurred, they would highly unlikely have survived because of the sheer force that was involved. Anyway, from then on, it appears that the Apollo Saturn V rocket performed flawlessly because it launched 6 missions to the moon. Apollo 8 was the first one. Apollo 10, so sorry, 9 missions to the moon. Apollo 10 was the second one, which didn't land. Then Apollo 11, 12, 13 was the one that didn't land either. We can come to that if you like later. 14, 15, 16, and 17. And then President Nixon, who was president at the time of the Apollo missions, cancelled the final 3 that were planned, 18, 19, and 20. And those rockets and equipment were used on the Skylab launch and also the Apollo-Soyuz link-up.
You went to a presentation which presented some information that made you start questioning what the official story was, or what we had all learned or saw or assumed. Had you had any inclination prior to that there might be something amiss here?
No, this was really the very first time which I'd heard that somebody mentioned the fact that maybe the Apollo missions weren't all that they were portrayed as. And that's what set me off. I'm always interested in finding out if things are correct or not. One has obviously heard about the controversy surrounding the JFK assassination, and the moon landings, I think, come into that same category. Obviously, with the internet now, it's a great deal easier to examine things and to research them and to find out information.
So,
sorry, go on.
No, it's okay. I just want to get back to that because 20 years ago, when this first was presented to you, I'm trying to put it in perspective. We did have some internet, but I imagine it was much more difficult for you to get a hold of the photographs at the time and actually start looking at them yourself. What was the process at that point?
Well, it was really, as I said, I had to go out and buy a set of photographs. I couldn't download them on the internet because there was only, do you remember dial-up internet?
Oh, yeah, sure, of course.
6K, I mean, it took forever to just write it. Emails were really only just coming into effect about the mid-90s, I think. I sent my first email.
Yeah.
But things have moved on very much since then, and it's really only in the last sort of 12, 15 years that it's been possible to examine this in detail. And what I discovered is there are a lot of people around the world who are examining this, and specifically the Russians. Now, one of the questions I usually get asked when I do public presentations on this subject is, well, if what you say is true, Marcus, how come the Russians didn't blow the whistle or announce that there was fraud going on or something fake happening? Why didn't they do that? Because it would have been to their benefit to say so.
Sure.
Which is something which is very easily assumed. But then if you look into it a little detail, you find out, well, the Russians would only have known what everybody else knew. They didn't have any special access to any information. They had a particularly different system of government, and it was not easy to access the information. It's only recently, since the demise of the Soviet Union, which is what Russia was, up till 1991, I believe, when the Berlin Wall was finally removed.
That's right.
And things sort of changed a bit. Now Russian scientists have started to examine the Apollo information in detail because they have access to it. And they have found enormous problems with it. They're the people who've done probably more research now. It's only in the last sort of 15 years or so that they've been able to do the research. I've actually been interviewed on Russian television talking about this subject. Unfortunately, I couldn't understand what it was I said, so I assumed that what I said was just dubbed into Russian. But they do have a considerable interest in the subject, especially from the filmmakers, because they're examining the films that are available. And there's one particularly interesting or quite amusing incident where some Russian filmmakers, having watched the Mythbusters program about the Apollo missions, where they claimed that they had busted all the hoax claims, the Russians decided that they would try to recreate this program, try to recreate the situation that they saw the Mythbusters had done. And they found that there appeared to be some deception involved, in that if you wear a white coat, which the Mythbusters did, or a white shirt, it will reflect enough light from the artificial light they were using to make the photograph of Aldrin coming down the ladder appear to be correct. Anyway, the Russians had sort of busted the Mythbusters, which I thought was quite amusing.
So let me take this back to the claim itself here. at what point in the story that we know or that we've been told, at what point is the hoax involved? Were the rockets ever sent up? If they were sent up, were they just not sent to the moon? Were there no astronauts on board? Where does the line between, what we know to be fact versus what we are contesting here?
A good question, very interesting question, because it shows up what actually happened. Now, most people, if they're around at the time or have seen film since, will remember seeing film of the Saturn V rockets taking off. Those were totally real. Those did take off. Where they went to 2 minutes after they launched, we have to rely on NASA to tell us, because that is the only source of information. The rockets certainly were launched, and after 2 minutes, the first stage was jettisoned and fell into the Atlantic, and Jeff Bezos has actually recovered the engines that were used in that launch. He's recovered one of the engines, because all the Saturn V rockets were launched over the Atlantic towards Africa, and they would then circle the Earth for about an hour and a half. It takes an hour and a half to circle the Earth, and then they would launch. From there, they would launch into what's called trans-lunar injection. They would fire the rocket again, or fire the third stage of the rocket, to get it fast enough, because in order to leave Earth's gravity, you have to accelerate up to 25,000 miles an hour. If you're in Earth orbit, you're doing 17,500 miles an hour. That's why it stays in Earth orbit and doesn't go off to the moon. If you're going to go to the moon, or any rocket that leaves Earth's gravitational field, has to accelerate to 25,000 miles an hour, which requires a considerable amount of fuel to do it, albeit there isn't the air resistance you'll get in the lower atmosphere. And we'll come back to the atmosphere and how that affects the returning craft later, possibly. So after the launch, 2 minutes after the launch, the rocket disappears from view, and we have to rely on NASA to tell us what happened until we see it coming back down to Earth on its 3 parachutes, in the case of Apollo 11, 8 days after the launch. The astronauts were picked up from the Pacific with President Nixon watching, and they were then flown back to Houston to go into quarantine for 3 weeks. Now, where the rocket went, we have to rely on NASA to tell us. Did it go to the moon? Well, most people will say, of course it went to the moon. I saw the TV pictures of them walking around on the lunar surface. How could that not be true? Well, I've seen 80-foot gorillas climb the Empire State Building. Is that real? I've seen dinosaurs chasing kids around kitchens in Jurassic Park. Very persuasive. We know it's not real because we know it's a film. But Apollo is presented as fact, as documentary evidence. In fact, there was a very good film made called First Man, released a few months ago, which I saw on the IMAX screen over here in the UK. And it's a very, very professional piece of Hollywood filmmaking. Hollywood can do an amazing amount of, not deception, because we know what we're watching. You know, when we watch 2001: A Space Odyssey, Stanley Kubrick's great masterpiece, we know we're watching a film, and these are models that we're prepared to suspend our disbelief and consider that it might be on its way to Jupiter. Now, Apollo, we're told, went to the moon, and we've seen the pictures of the astronauts on the moon. We've seen the 5,771 photographs taken on the lunar surface by all the Apollo missions. How can it not be real? How can it not be true? Very easily. If we go back a little bit to the beginning of the Apollo program, which was announced by President John Kennedy in May 1961, purely as a political statement following the orbit of the Earth by Yuri Gagarin from the Soviet Union, President Kennedy, who'd only been in office for about 4 months at that point, and he'd already had to deal with the Bay of Pigs fiasco, he had to do something to show that America were going to be, if not the leaders, in space travel. We're going to land a man on the moon before the decade is out and return him to the Earth. That was his challenge. Nobody at that time in America had even been into orbit. Alan Shepard had been up in the rocket and come straight back down again. It wasn't even an orbital flight. That was John Glenn about a year later. So America didn't actually know if they could do it, but the challenge was there. And in November 1963, we all know what happened to John Kennedy. So the martyred president's challenge had to be met. And this was the mission that Apollo was going to fulfill. Now, 400,000 people worked on the Apollo program at the height of the activity in about 1965. They were doing the very best job they could. They were building the best rockets they could, the best landers they could, the best control centers they could, the best spacesuits. They were doing whatever they were asked to do. They didn't know of any deception. Nobody knew of any deception at that time, except possibly a few people at the head of NASA who at some point in the mid-1960s, probably around the time of the disastrous events of Apollo 1, where 3 astronauts were killed when their spacecraft, which was being tested on Earth, exploded as a result of pressurized oxygen, which was filling the spacecraft. Anybody knows that if you put oxygen under pressure and then put an ignition source in it, it's going to explode. It's called a calorific bomb. And at that point, the Apollo program was virtually stopped, but they only had another 3 years to get to the moon, from January 1967 to the end of 1969. Were they going to be able to do it? Or were they going to have a plan B, a backup? Because one of the other points, which is quite often overlooked, though it's very obvious when you think about it, that all the Apollo missions were going to be live on television. Live on television. The one thing that NASA did not want to happen, or certainly nobody wanted to happen, was to see an astronaut die live on television.
Right.
So they had to make sure that it didn't happen. So was there a backup plan that could be shown as if the missions were for real? Because there is a very severe danger in traveling to the moon. It's called radiation. About 500 miles above the Earth's surface starts what's called, or what's known as now, the Van Allen radiation belts, named after Professor James Van Allen of Iowa University, who first identified them by the simple expedient of putting a Geiger counter on top of a rocket, sending it up, and seeing what the readings were. And as they said at the time, my God, space is radioactive. Because the readings of the Geiger counter were so severe that it would almost certainly be lethal to any unprotected human traveling through them. So I then looked, was there sufficient radiation protection in the spacecraft? Answer, no. Did they have any radiation protection in their spacesuits when they walked around on the lunar surface? Answer, no. So what was going on here? How were these? And if you've seen the recent test of the Orion capsule, which is Apollo 2.0, the Orion capsule was sent out in December 2014, about 5,000 miles out on its first test, and then it was brought back, and there's a film where a NASA engineer says,
as we get further away from Earth, we'll pass through the Van Allen belts, an area of dangerous radiation. Radiation like this could harm the guidance systems, onboard computers, or other electronics on Orion. Naturally, we have to pass through this danger zone twice, once up and once back. But Orion has protection. Shielding will be put to the test as the vehicle cuts through the waves of radiation. Sensors aboard will record radiation levels for scientists to study. We must solve these challenges before we send people through this region of space.
Well, why don't you just use what you used on Apollo? It seemed to be pretty successful then.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Has anybody ever put that question to a NASA official and gotten a satisfactory answer? When the question is asked, how were these astronauts protected in the high levels of radiation of space? Have we got an answer to that at all?
Basically, they went through them so fast it didn't affect them.
We've talked a lot about some of the evidence that might support the idea that the Apollo missions did not happen as they were portrayed. We haven't talked a lot about motivation. Let's take the next couple minutes and talk about the motivation of faking such a monumental hoax. Why would NASA or the U.S. government, or anybody for that matter, want to fake something of this magnitude?
That's a very good question, and it basically you need to look at the Apollo program in the context of its time. This is the 1960s, where we have the Cold War going on between the Soviet Union and the United States. We have the Vietnam War ramping up from the mid-1960s onwards, with horrific images coming through. We have the space race going on, where the United States need to demonstrate their technical superiority. Apollo was the good news in a decade of assassinations and disaster and social unrest. The civil rights movement was also in full swing. There was a great deal of bad news. Apollo was going to be the good news, and it was, because it was successful, or it appeared to be, was presented as being successful. It was perfectly possible to recreate all the Apollo images here on Earth, and in fact that was done. All the missions were simulated. There was a lot of training took place. None of it secret. Everybody knew what was going on. In fact, there's a full-scale replica of the Sea of Tranquility where Apollo 11 landed at Cinder Lake outside Flagstaff in Arizona. You can go and see it today. There are also models made, large models. A lot of simulation, a lot of training was done. Therefore, it would be perfectly possible to film the whole thing here on Earth. And I contend that that was what was done, but presented as being shown live from the moon. Now we then have to ask the question, what power would be required to transmit a television picture live from the moon to the Earth, 240,000 miles? And most people will say, well, you just point it in the right direction and you pick it up here on Earth. There's nothing to stop the picture coming through. Well, there's 240,000 miles of space, and you do get a loss of power over that distance. You then get the atmosphere it has to travel through. It has to be collected by a big receiver, and the only one that did it for Apollo 11 was based in Australia at Honeysuckle Creek. There were 3 other receivers in California and in Spain, so that the whole thing could be recorded as it happened. But was it being recorded from the moon, or was it here on Earth and being transmitted through a very complex computer system? People really want to believe that this happened, because if they're American, as obviously many of your listeners will be, this is almost part of American culture. So how can some Brit come along and challenge it? I mean, it doesn't make sense, really, does it? Or maybe it does, because somebody outside the emotional bubble which NASA has built around the Apollo missions may well be able to look more dispassionately at it, and I hope that's what I can do. And in fact, there's been a considerable amount of research recently. There are 2 new books just been published. They're on Amazon. One is called The Apollo Missions, Hiding a Hoax in Plain Sight, Part 1. Now that's by a Canadian author called Randy Walsh, but his book is extremely interesting because he is a commercial pilot, so he knows about how to navigate across distances, which is what the Apollo missions did coming back from the moon. It's not simple as saying, well, there's the Earth, we'll just go for it, because the Earth is moving in relation to the Apollo craft in this case. So did they have the computing power to be able to navigate across 240,000 miles of space? If you're navigating an aircraft, you use radio beacons. You don't fly by following a river, or not anymore, used to back in the 1920s. You don't follow by landmarks, you follow by extremely sophisticated navigational equipment. But Apollo didn't have any of this. The computing power on Apollo was almost minuscule compared to what you carry around with a smartphone today. So there is considerable amount of doubt that it was possible to navigate from the Earth to the Moon, let alone from the Moon back to the Earth. And coming back to the Earth is actually one of the most remarkable stories of survival that I can think of. If you're coming back from the Moon, you arrive on Earth at 25,000 miles an hour, same speed you left at. It's the gravitational attraction that is accelerating you. But you've got to slow down, otherwise you're going to get toast. And the only way to slow down, because spacecraft don't have brakes, you've got to slow down by using the atmosphere, which is only 75 miles, starts 75 miles above the Earth's surface, the atmosphere itself. You've got to use the atmosphere to slow you down. By doing that, you're going to generate enormous amount of heat. So you have to have a heat shield. And a heat shield is made of material which will basically destroy itself in the heat of re-entry. Now, if you're coming back to the Earth, you've got to come back at a very, very acute angle. You can't hit the Earth head on, or you will be toast, you'll be pancaked. You've got to come in at 6.5 degrees to the Earth's surface, so you've got about 1,000 miles to slow down. You're doing 25,000 miles an hour, so it's not going to take you very long. So the gravitational forces exerted on the spacecraft are really quite severe. They used the heat shield, which apparently slowed all 9 Apollo craft coming back from the Moon, slowed them down successfully. But when the same attempt was used on the Orion craft in December 2014, the heat shield almost disintegrated. So why don't they just use the formula they used for the Apollo? It's called AV5061, AFCOT. And also, another strange thing about the Orion craft was it had heat shield all over it. The Apollo craft didn't. The Apollo craft are made of aluminium, and aluminium melts at 600 degrees centigrade. The heat of re-entry will generate up to 3,000 degrees centigrade of heat. So why wasn't the craft destroyed? That's an unanswered question.